and welcome to Humans of Clinical Academia. I'm Judith Johnson, and this is the show where I get to speak to leading clinical academics, and you get to find out why they got into clinical work, how they stepped into research, and how they've overcome challenges. Our guest today started life in North Manchester, but has since travelled the globe to deliver emergency medical care to countries in the grip of war, natural disasters and epidemics. Professor Tony Redmond responded to the Lockerbie bombing of 1988, the Haitian earthquake of 2010, and spent nearly 4 years in Sarajevo during the Bosnian War. During this time, he faced the Serbian dictator Radovan Karadzic face-to-face, narrowly avoided sniper bullets, and experienced the wall of air that hits survivors when a grenade detonates only metres away. Alongside all this, Tony has maintained an active research career, publishing over 150 papers and co-founding the Humanitarian Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester in 2008. Welcome, Tony. You've chosen to do the podcast today over a cup of instant coffee.
Yes.
I have to ask, why instant instead of the fresh pressed version?
Well, when I was growing up, we only ever drank tea in the house. And we drank tea leaves, a spoonful of tea leaves in a cup. And then water was on it, very strong, and you kept the tea leaves in it, and you sort of drank the tea through it. That's how I was brought up. And then in my teens, we somehow were introduced to instant coffee in a jar, which I thought was very exotic, and I still do. And I find that the stronger coffee and the going to Costa Coffee and other brands are available. I find it just too strong. It's not coffee to me, and so I probably actually don't like coffee. I like whatever you would call instant coffee with milk.
In your book, Frontline, you describe your childhood growing up in North Manchester in the 50s and 60s. You came from a Catholic family and describe experiencing poverty, but also growing up surrounded by love. Can you share more about your experiences of growing up with us?
Yeah, I came from a big family. There was mum and dad. There were 6 children, and we had an aunt that lived with us. She came apparently to look after the 3rd child when they were born, and never went. She didn't have a bed. She slept on the sofa downstairs, and she looked after all of us. It was very warm. Looked after. In many ways, I was looked after by my aunt and by my siblings, for whom I've been very, very close to, and still am. And I'm the 5th of 6 children, and I've got 2 older sisters and 1 younger sister, and then 2 older brothers than that. And so it was a very good combination, and they all loved me to bits and looked after me. I know, I have to admit it. I was spoilt in that way. And they still do look after me. I used to go to the football match with my older brother, and I'd be in my 50s then, and he'd be in his 60s, and he would always ring me up on my mobile, just as I'm getting there, and saying, could I find a parking spot? Could he'd find one for me? And he'd park my car for me if I wanted. So I'm very fortunate.
This is a good moment for your first picture, which shows a tea towel. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yes, this is a tea towel on which are the embroidered signatures of probably about 50 women, maybe fewer, who were all the survivors of a Japanese prisoner of war camp in Burma. And one of those signatures says Sister Stephanie. And Sister Stephanie was the religious name of my Auntie Frances, who had become a missionary nun in Burma and was taken prisoner and suffered greatly, terribly. There was a book written about their experiences by the wife of the American ambassador who was also interred. The book was called And Three Came Home. She talks about how they all survived and came home. But in it, she mentions a nun who, she said, how they were all starving, but the nuns gave most of their food to the children and starved even more. And one she picked out as saying was being particularly kind was Sister Stephanie. And it's in the book. And also there was a film made of it with Deborah Kerr, and the Sister Stephanie appears in it. But when the war, my parents thought that she died because they heard nothing. And then after the war, they got a telegram, and we have the telegram from Australia that she'd been liberated by the Australians. She was on her way home. My eldest brother, Brian, went to meet the hospital train in Manchester when she arrived, and he was still upset by the fact that when he went to see her, he ran out of the train screaming because he said there was a skeleton in the bed. But she recovered. She left the order. She got married. She trained as a midwife at North Manchester General Hospital and then became a district midwife in Liverpool. And my Auntie Mary, who lived with us, used to take me and my sister to Liverpool every weekend. And we used to stay with Auntie Frances. And it was a ball. Auntie Frances was lovely. I didn't know until much later all that she'd been through. She was funny. She spoiled us rotten. My parents were quite strict. Auntie Frances and Auntie Mary let us do what we wanted, and it was lovely. And I used to go on her rounds with her as a district midwife, as a little boy. She only insisted that I put my gabardine on and wore my school cap, and I used to carry her bag as we went round. And I remember, going. We didn't have a telephone at home, but she had one downstairs and one upstairs by her bed. And then in the night, you'd hear the one, and she'd go out. And then in the morning, I can remember one time she'd come in and she said what she'd been doing in the night. She says, and she always called me son. She said, "Come on, son, do you want to go and see the new baby?" I said, "Yes." So we went. I went with her, and then the family would give me cups of tea and biscuits, and while she went to see the mum and the baby, it was magical, and it really was. It was a very different time, but it had a profound effect on me. I saw the work that she was doing was valuable and was valued. Her married name was Gannon, and I used to walk along the street carrying a bag, and men wore hats in those days, and they would lift their cap and say, "Good morning, Sister Gannon." And I thought, that's my aunt. so it really attracted me to healthcare professions, really.
That picture of midwifery that you paint of, going with your aunt on her visits, of her receiving a lot of respect when she was out on the street, how does that compare, do you think, to the experiences of midwives or maybe healthcare professionals more generally today?
Very different. I think particularly, it's very much like Call the Midwife. It was the same thing, that many children, many babies were delivered at home. And so the district midwifery service was very important. And she lived in the community that she served, so she was known by everyone. She knew all them. She had a great deal of autonomy, and she was extremely well. She was extremely experienced, and she could manage a lot of things. So I think that degree of autonomy and independence has probably gone now. There's been obvious reasons why deliveries have moved more into hospital and how much safer that is. But at that time, I think there was a huge respect for the midwife. I think now we've got more into teams and things. I don't want to say, it was all great before, and it's not, but it's changed. And I think the individual care, the individuals themselves, that's changed. Like, for example, my general practitioner, Dr. Creswell, who saved my life when he diagnosed my TB. A wonderful man. But there he was in his little surgery in Failsworth, and we all knew him. He would come to us, and we had enormous respect for him. And he, in fairness, he had enormous autonomy. But he, I think it might be in the book, but when I was first appointed a consultant, you always get asked to go and give talks to your local hospital, and I gave one in Oldham. And when I'd finished my talk, I would ask for any questions, and Dr. Creswell stood up, like he was my parent. He was so proud, and he said, I haven't got a question, Anthony, because at home they all called me Anthony. He said, I just wanted to let everyone know that I delivered you.
Oh, that's so sweet, isn't it? So you describe those really positive experiences of kind of watching healthcare professionals when you were growing up. In your book, Frontline, you also describe more difficult experiences of medical snobbery, of the tragic loss of your Aunt Mary to tuberculosis. How did those events, impact you on your journey towards becoming a doctor?
It gave me a sort of hard-headedness. There was tremendous snobbery, both towards those of us who were not as well off as others, even in a community where the difference between the haves and not was really, really quite small. But there was a tremendous snobbery, and in particularly shopkeepers and certainly the local chemist, the pharmacist. He showed disdain, and it angered me because I thought there is no need for this at all, and not in a sort of snobbish way, but I knew my family, I knew my parents, I knew my aunts. We're better than this. These are people you should be admiring, not scorning. So it filled me with a real fire and a fight that hasn't gone away. And I see it on the international stage with regards to giving assistance to countries, the disdain that people, some countries, some politicians may have for some presidents, may have for others. And it angers me because it's unfair and it's not necessary and it's shallow. And as people, we can do better than that. And, Dr. Creswell, for example, my GP, always treated me as a child and with utmost respect. As a small child, he would listen to me. And they're the things that I value. But I found that in medicine itself, as I was a medical student, as a junior doctor, some of them were unnecessarily snobbish, which of course is exclusion. Not all. And there were some amazing exceptions. I was really lucky in my first house job, the very first job, to work for Dr. Richard Huddy, who was wonderful. In fact, I still see him. He's in his 90s, and I still go and see him. And he was fabulous. He was a really good physician, very clever, but very knowledgeable and very good with patients. And he taught me so much by showing me how to do it. Instead of, they talk about medical education, education by ridicule and humiliation, just asking you questions until you can't answer. It was quite the opposite. He would show you. I remember I found it difficult to use an ophthalmoscope. Where you hold it, it's got the light and you look into the back of the eye. And it's quite hard to coordinate. You have to get the light steady through the pupil and then turn the dial to get the lens to see at the back of the eye and move it. I just found it difficult to coordinate. And he saw me doing it on a ward round. So what he did was, he never criticised me in front of anyone. At the end of the ward round, he said, he got the sister, he said, because I couldn't afford my own ophthalmoscope. He got the sister, he said, Dr. Redmond will carry the ward ophthalmoscope in his pocket at all times. If you want it, he's got it. That was the first. And then he said to me, look in the back of the eyes of every patient you see, whether or not it's relevant. And he said, you'll just get used to it and you will get better. And I did. And I thought, that's how you educate people. And again, you see, he was kind. He was not snobbish. He had a lot to show off about, given how good a consultant he was. He never did. He was just kind.
Your aunt was a former Catholic nun, as you've mentioned, and your dad was also, for a time, a Catholic monk before he disrobed. In general, Catholicism sounds like it was a strong theme in your childhood. How did this influence your outlook and your views growing up?
The Catholic influence is even wider. My uncle was a priest, and my eldest brother was a monk and almost became a priest. So there's very strong. I did consider it myself for a while, but then I thought it wasn't for me. And by the time I got to university, I didn't think religion was for me. Not in any hostile way. I just didn't see the need for it, and I've never adopted religion of any kind since. But what I did take from it, and I hope this comes over, that my father in particular with regard to religion, and my aunts had enormous kindness, and that's what I thought religion was. They were happy. They didn't have very much. I was shocked the first time I met a rich Catholic. I didn't think you could be. I'm serious. That to me, Catholics was all about people in Liverpool and in poorer areas, but this idea of I can remember having talks with my father, a very small boy, and he was all about loving and doing things for other people and do as you would be done by. But never in a religious setting. It was always of itself. I've read some philosophy since, and it's sort of deontological thing, and it dawned on me in my teenage years that what I valued was doing good, helping people of and for itself. And I did quickly find that the religious aspect just detracted from that. You didn't need it, and it was an extra baggage around something that of itself I thought was good. So I was then, having decided I wasn't going to be a priest, I thought it would be a doctor. And if I could just say one thing about this, again, just the way my father put it to me when, because he tried to be, he was a monk and then tried to be a priest, but he came out of it. And he sort of lived the life of a monk. He never had a bank account, never had a car, never had any. He only ever had one pair of shoes, because he was a painter and decorator. When the priest came, he would paint them black because they were all spotted. And he only ever had one suit, and that was for my graduation. He just wasn't interested in material things at all. But he said to me, like if he had regrets or what he would have done, he said, if I had become a priest or a doctor, he said, just before I went to sleep, I'd give myself a little hug. I remember him saying, because he wasn't like that. He wasn't sentimental. He wasn't that, but he was like musing. And I thought, wow, he thinks so highly of it. So I thought, well, okay, I'll give myself a little hug.
Professor Tony Redmond, you were later successful in gaining a place at the University of Manchester to study medicine, and said that on your first day you realised that you had jumped from what was officially the lowest social grade, which was a 5, to the highest, which was a 1, just simply by entering medical school. It had changed kind of how you were viewed in the government's eyes in that sense. How did you find this change?
Puzzling. I found it quite amusing, because they did this. This was an ongoing study at the time in Manchester, looking at social class and university entrance, but particularly in medical school. And our our year apparently matched 1908 in terms of social class distribution. There were more of us, but I found that horrifying that it hadn't changed. Because we thought I was a child of the 60s, this was all changing, but it wasn't changing that much. So I was initially amused, but then I did find it quite difficult. I remember people at the university, amazing, having a Manchester accent in Manchester, people mocking it. Yeah, particularly in the medical school and amongst, and it just made me exaggerate it more than anything, given the type of person I am. But there was that, and there was that increasingly, it was mixing with people from a very different social background that was quite alien to me, that I found puzzling. I didn't understand them. They didn't really understand me. I did understand the patients because many of them came from a similar background. So, but it's a funny thing. In fact, there's a group of us now at the university, led by Siobhan Cartwright at the medical school, who's setting up a group called First Generation to support support staff and academics who come into universities as first generation, and we all have sort of similar tales. It's that you don't have the language, that you don't pick up on the cues. It's odd. I mean, you get better at it, but it's and it's a long time ago now, and I don't. And also, you get the trappings of a different social class as you get older, particularly with titles and things. The moment you become a doctor, it actually puzzled my father, me being a doctor. It troubled him because his image, I remember him telling me about it, his image of what a doctor was altered radically by the fact that I could become a doctor. And that, when we had that conversation, it disturbed both of us, really.
At one point, you considered dropping out of medical school, but you didn't. What advice would you have for a student who is feeling like maybe they don't belong or it's too challenging and they are thinking about dropping out?
First of all, I would say if you want to drop out, do drop out, but think very carefully about it and consider what you are losing, particularly with medicine. I mean, I was persuaded to stay by my father, who said I didn't have to engage emotionally with it, just get the degree, because I wanted to go and do something in the arts. And he played me very well about that to keep me in, but he was absolutely right. And I was hospital dean at Salford Royal for a few years, and I had students come to see me who very bright, very committed, but just didn't feel that medicine was for them. And my advice to them was that you're in medicine now. There are many people who say, I could have been a doctor. I wanted to be a doctor. I could have do what you're doing, but they didn't. You are doing it, and it's a great privilege. And a lot comes with doing a medical course and getting the degree, not just clinical medicine. So I encourage them to do the degree just for itself. Just, if you look at, as my father pointed out to me, there are many artists, musicians, writers and things who did medicine and then never practiced. And that was our secret plan. I was going to do that, not tell anyone. I was being like a secret agent in medical school, because I was really going to be I wanted to be a musician. But and I would tell them to do that. And then once you've got the degree, then you are a different prospect for employers. First of all, you will see yourself quite differently, and you'll be affected by the way the world sees you. And that's a good thing. You will have that. The discipline of medicine is great training. You will meet people as patients. You will learn so much. and don't feel you have to practice medicine at the end. People say, oh, well, you've got to pay back what you do. Well, you don't do that for French. You don't say, right, I've done my degree in French, you must speak French for the rest of your life now. I mean, I know it's ridiculous. So you can do it. It's a university. It's an education. But it would be great if you can practice. And increasingly, there are many different ways you can use your medical degree. One student I remember in particular, very bright and quite torn because he thought he only had about a year to go, but he said he really wanted to do computers and make apps and do all that. I said, and your point is you don't think you can do the two together? And, it seems an obvious thing, but he said, oh. Anyway, to cut a long story short, he did complete his degree and he went into medical information technology and did extremely well.
This moves us nicely onto your second image, which I believe shows Derbyshire House at Manchester University. Can you tell us about this?
Yes, I struggled initially as a medical student. I found it very hard to adjust. I didn't feel I fitted in at all. And a couple of things happened. Number one, at the start of my second year, I met my future wife, who was my wife, and that had a big stabilising effect on me. Also, interestingly, I realised she had no expectations of me. We just had fun together, and that was a relief. I thought, and then I settled down. And then when in the fourth year we did general practice, and I did my elective I could never decide whether I was going to do general practice or psychiatry when I qualified. So I did a split elective between general practice and psychiatry. And general practice was housed at Derbyshire House. And Manchester University had the first professor of general practice, certainly in the UK, possibly in the world, Patrick Byrne. But his senior lecturer was Conrad Harris, who later became Professor Conrad Harris, who died only a few years ago, sadly. But I did my elective with him, and he was fabulous. And first of all, he treated me like an adult. I mean, I was 21, 22. But he taught me that to ask questions and how you would answer those questions. And you mentioned my Catholic upbringing. My mother in particular was vehemently anti-abortion and was quite, she'd go on demonstrations and all sorts. It was all that sort of Catholic thing, which I'd moved away from by then, but I wanted to know more about it. And I was discussing that with him, and he said, well, there's your project. You can ask questions. And that introduced me to research. And in fact, I went to what is now the Pregnancy Advisory Service. But the first abortion clinic was in Birmingham. And I went there and got ethical approval and permission to interview the women, who were very forthcoming. And so I did, what I realise now, I did a mixed methods paper under the guidance of Conrad and published it to find out and it was about attitudes and to abortion. And that was revelatory. I thought, yes, ask questions and then work to get the answers.
Professor Tony Redmond, despite your strong academic career, you're actually mainly known for your work in global emergency medicine. Your fourth set of pictures relate to this work. Can you tell us about them?
Yes, my research and clinical work was all about resuscitation and trauma care. I was very interested in cardiac arrest. I'd worked with a physician, Dennis Edwards, who was an intensivist, and he was very questioning about cardiac arrest. And I worked with him, and we published a lot on that. And also, I found there were a number of areas, each needed, just like Conrad Harris had told me, you're asking questions, then find the answer. Is this the right way to do things? And so, like cardiac arrest, the treatments we do, do they work? Why don't? So we looked at that. Then, of course, the management of major injuries, major trauma. We looked at that. I worked as a lecturer with the Medical Research Council. We looked at the metabolic response to injury. I worked with Dennis on the physiological response. So it was all a very technical physiological. I did zinc excretion after trauma, all these things. But as part of managing emergencies and trauma care, we needed research on the systems. You had to get, as the cliches always, get the right person to the right place in the right time. And so I realised the great weakness we had was before they got to hospital. So we needed to train the ambulance service. We introduced the first paramedic training scheme. We needed to get senior staff out to the sites of accidents and so on. We did all that. We set up the South Manchester Accident Rescue Team, and then the earthquake in Armenia happened in 1988, and we were asked to take the team. And that was transformational for me, because all the issues that I'd had on a smaller local scale were just writ large. And then on the way back, I'd only been back 12 hours maybe, I was called to the Lockerbie air disaster. So in a few weeks, I'd been to the biggest earthquake or sudden onset disaster of the 20th century, certainly one of them, and the largest terrorist attack over it. But it had a huge effect on me. Psychologically, it hit me very, very hard. But also, it changed my sense of priorities. I enjoyed doing highly technical research, but I thought there were bigger things that needed looking at. And again, people were doing things without question, just as we'd done in emergency medicine and in trauma care, questioning everything. Why do we do it this way? Can we do it better? I asked, why do we do it? There was so much wasted effort. And so I did a change, and my research and clinical interests shifted. I was still very interested in the management of major trauma, and I was invited to help lead an experimental trauma centre in North Staffordshire, along with which I became Foundation Professor of Emergency Medicine. And I had an opportunity then to, I wasn't balancing the conflict between clinical work and academic work, which is a major thing for people. I found that really hard until I got a full-time academic post. Clinical work was part of it, but it was primarily, it was a university post, and it was too. And I'd said at my interview that I wanted to do research. I would help lead the trauma centre, would look at the management of severe injuries and systems, but I also wanted to look at international systems as part of that work, and I got quite substantial external funding for that. And that shifted my work then onto international work, and it just grew from there, one incident after another, working with UN agencies, working with WHO and so on.
You describe experiencing some symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder due to your humanitarian work. How did you overcome this?
My immediate reaction, I didn't. I learned to live with it. And I don't mean that glibly, because I could still reflect on things and become as upset. Now I don't know whether this is good or bad. I'm just being frank, but I've learnt to manage it. I was on a panel some years ago with Jeremy Boyne, of all people, the BBC News correspondent, and he's had difficulties with. He's been subject to shelling and bombing, and he lost a colleague who was actually quite close by, and we got chatting about things, and I said to him that I found the first time I gave talks about Armenia and Lockerbie, I got quite tearful as I'm giving the talk, and I quite ambushed me. I wasn't expecting it. I didn't know what to do. So the technique I learned was I had polished vignettes, I call them, that I rehearsed. I knew what they meant, and I said the same thing every time, and I could do it. And he said, I do the same. and because I thought I was revealing too much. I thought he'd think I don't know what he'd think. But he said, I do exactly the same. And so I think that's how you deal with it. I've never found value in going back over it. When I wrote the book, my wife noticed that I was getting upset and more withdrawn, like I was when I came back from Armenia, and she warned me about it. So I broke off from the writing and that. But by and large, fine. If I put it out of the way, I can manage. And also, the more experienced you are, and the more trained you are, the more capable you are, that you have the skills, it's less stressful. It's still stressful. Part of the problems I felt in the early days of doing this work was those of inadequacy. They think I wasn't doing enough, or I should have done more, I should have known. And in fact, you learn pretty quickly that there are some things that are so massive that you can only try your best and do what you can, where you can, and that you are not failing. And so, and then you get used to that. But I've had an enormously supportive family around me, and I've got better at dealing with it. But it is a factor that we all deal with. I'm being very cautious speaking to a psychologist, and I go out of my lane, as the phrase is. But to my mind, I distinguish between post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. And by disorder, I think means that it significantly interferes with my functioning. I mean, that's I'm bow to your experience. But that, I've noticed in myself, I think when I came back from Armenia, I definitely had the D on the end of the PTS. I was affected my relationship at home. I was very withdrawn. And I dealt with it by thinking I will do it better, and I will do things. But whereas other times I've been very stressed, but I've been able to function.
Your fifth picture relates to experiences you had following the Bosnian War. Can you tell us more about this?
After Sarajevo, and in fact I worked throughout all the Balkans, I started to become ill, but I thought I would. I kept putting it off going to the doctors because I was in Sarajevo, but I did seek medical advice when I got back, and clearly things were not right, and I had signs of an autoimmune disease. And in fact, I had some surgery. I had some other problems, but they never quite got to the bottom of it. And then I was asked to go to Kosovo. So I went to Kosovo, which was as stressful as Sarajevo, and I worked there for a year. And during that time, I became more ill, really quite ill. I lost a lot of weight. And when all that had finished, I thought, well, I need to get all this sorted out. But also, I started to have involuntary muscle twitches. And I didn't go and seek help because I thought I had motor neuron disease. And I thought, well, I'm not sure I want to know. But my long-suffering wife said, yeah, but the family would quite like to know. In a nice way, I'm sorry. I mean, she said, but, we need to know. So I went and I had the test. Jeremy Dick was the neurologist who was wonderful to me, very kind. And anyway, I didn't have motor neuron didn't know quite what it was. And by then I was getting more and more symptoms. And the return of the abdominal pain that I'd had before. To cut a long story short, I developed problems with my kidneys and with my liver. And I had heavy metal poisoning. Lead, uranium, so much so there was a granuloma, a big collection of heavy metals in the liver, and it was affecting the kidneys. And so I had to stop work. And that was terrible. I felt a failure. And then once they got the diagnosis, I then had chelation therapy, which they put chemicals into. So I was admitted to hospital to have this over a week, 1 week a month, for, I don't know, a year. I had to keep going on having it. And gradually, as the heavy metals were coming out in the urine, the antibodies that I had that were forming what was a form of stiff person syndrome came down, and my jerks began to stop. I used to hate it. I'd be sat next to someone, you suddenly jerk, and it was horrible. But they all went slowly. I still get them occasionally, but it's all gone. And I then got back to work, and I came back to work at the university. I worked with Bertrand Tate. We set up the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute, and I was hospital dean at Salford Royal, and I started getting back into work, and then I started doing more. So I went after an earthquake in China, which to my wife's annoyance, as I got my health back, but it had a profound effect on me. But the reason why I put the picture in, I got a paper in the Lancet out of it.
Silver lining.
Silver lining, not all bad.
You say in your book Frontline that you think you were probably poisoned with uranium on purpose.
Yes.
Are humanitarian workers often a target in your experience?
Yes. It didn't used to be, but that's changed enormously. Similarly to the press, if you would go into a conflict area and you had press written all over it, they would expect some degree of protection. If you went in with humanitarian aid or a Red Cross, you would expect some degree of protection. For me, that all changed in Sarajevo, where you became a target. I was targeted. Many healthcare workers are. You can see now in Gaza, healthcare workers have been killed. You see it in Ukraine. So that's been an enormous shift. In fact, HCRI, where I'm now emeritus professor, has a big research program researching impacts on health, research into the attacks on healthcare RIA, which they're looking not only just at documenting the number of attacks, which the Red Cross and MSF do, but their wider impact has a huge impact on the delivery or non-delivery of healthcare. So we're actually, HCRI is actually researching that.
Wow. This brings us to your last picture, which shows one of your earlier experiences for humanitarian work. It shows a tented hospital which was built on the Iran-Iraq border. Can you tell us more about this?
Yes, I can feel myself already smiling. You would think that it would be a sad event, but it wasn't. We'd been to an earthquake in Iran the year before, even though UK had no diplomatic relations or anything. We were invited in through the Iranian Red Crescent and were treated very well. We were in a military hospital in Tehran, but it was all fine. They treated us well. We did an awful lot of really quite impactful work. I was very proud of what we did. And I was pleased that the year afterwards, the first Gulf War, there was the Kurdish refugees. Many went into Turkey, and there was an awful lot of attention given to their plight. But of course, people couldn't get into Iran, and many refugees had gone into Iran. Well, they were held at the top of the mountain. And the Iranian government rang me up and said, would take the team and set up a tented hospital on the top of the mountain, on the border, and to go in through Tehran. So that's what we did. There were 18 of us, and that's what we did. And I was so pleased with so many things about it. I was pleased that we'd been invited back in, that they had that trust in us, and that we formed such good relations. I know people have all these reservations about Iran and all these things, but I found the individual people that I met with warm and friendly. And so we set up this. There was very little there. We couldn't take much overland with us, and it was very, very high up. But there was this camp of about 30,000 people, and the Iranian army had set up a sort of hospital tent that was just giving out a few medicines. And we arrived there in a few trucks with our kit and our personnel, and it was going dark. And there was a military post nearby because it was the border, and they had a machine gun mount. It was really quite foreboding. And the leader of the camp, he took us immediately to what they call the hospital tent, where there were these mothers holding two small infants who were desperately ill. They had what's called, well, to our mind, opisthotonus, is where the meningitis is so severe that the baby arches backwards like a bow shape, which is usually a sign of, impending death, really. It posed a number of problems. I thought these children are going to die in spite of what we do, and but we have to do something for them. And so I looked at them. I thought they could possibly have tetanus, in which case there is nothing we can do for them if it's got to this stage, really, in these circumstances. But it could just be severe meningitis. So I said, let's put some drips up and give them very broad spectrum antibiotics. And they look very skinny and dehydrated. And let's rehydrate them and see what happens. And then I went round for the rest of the night, going round the camp, assessing all the needs with the elders of the camp and so on. And then I remember it so clearly when I came back, and the dawn was breaking, and I went to the tent, and the cots where the babies were empty. And I thought, okay, we'll have to deal with this. But the nurse who was looking at them was smiling. I thought, what? And then she took me in and pointed, and the babies were in their mother's laps and looked much better. They were drowsy, they were sick, they didn't have opisthotonus, and they were in the laps and the drips were up, and they were clearly responding to treatment. And it had a profound effect on me, in that I thought, we take for granted so much of what we have. These were simple medicines. It was a simple diagnosis to make. There was, this was no, you wouldn't have your life in their hands program about this. This was straightforward, and it saved their lives. And it wouldn't have happened if we weren't there. And it struck me that so many people, children in particular, die of such simple things that are easily corrected. And the other thing it taught me was a confidence in the skills that I had. I thought, I have been well trained. I know stuff. It's a gift. I have been given this gift by being trained, and all the people who helped me get here, you did this. And I thought, wow. And I thought, we need to do more of this. And doing this work, you always get people who are very cynical. I've had tremendous criticism over the years, some of it very hurtful and some of it very direct. I try to listen to it all. Well, I do listen to it all, and I try to take it objectively. I understand people's concerns. And if I had any doubts about the work, they all went. I thought, this is what it's about. Delivering simple stuff, those circumstances. And it sort of fueled me and the whole team. We thought, yeah, we can do this.
Is humanitarian medical work only for medics, or can other healthcare professionals also step forwards?
It's for everyone. It is for everyone. We need a whole team. In fact, we had that team there on the Iranian-Iraq border was 6 doctors, 6 nurses and 6 paramedics. And when we did a debrief afterwards, everyone, each of those groups thought they'd done the most and had the biggest effect, when in fact it was what everyone had done together. So the paramedics said, well, you couldn't have done anything with ours. We screened everybody, we filtered them, we took out the cases. It would never have functioned without you. And the nurse said, yeah, but we saw the most patients, which is true. We did, that was absolutely true. And the doctor said, well, we might have seen fewer, but they were very complicated, you know. And in fact, everyone laughed in the end. I thought, we were a team, and we needed it all together. And we came up with certain rules which we still apply, and that is, if a job can be done by anyone, it's done by everyone. And then if a job can only be done by you, then it's done by you.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of our interview today. Professor Tony Redmond, thank you so much for joining us. To our listeners, thank you so much for choosing to join us for Humans of Clinical Academia. If you're listening to this interview on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and want to see the images that we discuss, please visit our Instagram page at Manchester_Catalys or go to YouTube at Manchester Catalys, all one word. Humans of Clinical Academia is a Manchester Catalys podcast. Manchester Catalys is a partnership between the University of Manchester and Manchester University NHS Foundation Trust, and we're grateful for their support, which made this recording possible. I'd also like to thank my Manchester Catalys colleagues, and especially Umang Sinha for production and editing.